Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I know it has been a moment, but I think I've come up with something that should excite most of you. I know that mine has been a little bit lacking since we lost our normal short story contest, so I decided to start one of my own. I won't be offering a token prize, however. This prize will be to hear your story produced like an audiobook. Now, I do have a few rules which I have made up for the contest, and I do believe they're fair. First of all, we're only going to be doing one story a month. To be eligible, a story can contain no more than 2,000 words. I'm sorry, that's just the limit to my editing. When you create your story, it has to be tagged with the provided hashtag that will be in the description and on the post on minds.com. You will also be asked to tag me so that I can make sure I see it. If you don't tag me, chances are I won't be able to read it and therefore won't be able to judge it. The stories also need to be YouTube friendly because they're going to go up on YouTube and on BitChute and on Rumble. So that means no graphic sexual content, and I'm not upset with violence, just use your own personal discretion. The judging will be done by me. It's not going to be done by the number of likes and shares, though getting a lot of likes and shares is a good indication that your story did well. I encourage everybody who enters to read the other entries as well. This is about improving our writing and getting more exposure for the different authors and storytellers here on Minds. And just as a treat and as a sample for everybody who is hoping to enter one of these contests, I am providing another story that was written by our very own Tim Burnham. Artemis. She had chosen to name herself after the Greek goddess of the hunt. It fit considering the training, the enhancements, and the heavily modified L115A3 rifle she had slung over her shoulder. But despite the name, her training, and her weapon, Artemis was the one being hunted. It should be dead! The thought had crossed her mind more than once as she struggled through the thigh-deep snowdrifts of the Canadian wilderness, and she would be dead if not for Goliath. Lynx had dumped a whole magazine into the white-furred monster, but it hadn't even slowed, grabbing him and painting the snow red with his insides. It was a horrible image that was now branded into Artemis's memory. The monster had immediately turned from what was left of Lynx and rushed her, terrifyingly fast for something so large. She had gotten one round into its furry hide before it had grabbed her. Its claws had punched through both her Arctic coat and body armor, right into the skin around her ribs. She remembered gasping, both from surprise and pain. It would have done the same thing to her as it had done to Lynx, if Goliath hadn't jumped on its back, roaring like some animal himself and stabbing over and over again with his combat knife. It was a knife to him, but in Artemis's hand it would have looked more like a short sword. Technically they were all super soldiers, but Goliath was the only one who Artemis thought fit the description. 6'6", 305 pounds with a body fat percentage less than 12. He more than lived up to his name. Almost big enough for Dad to let me date him. Her little joke was instantly crushed by the memory of the thing grabbing Goliath off its back and literally tearing him apart. His knife had done its work, though. The monster had collapsed just a few moments after it finished him off. Goliath's sacrifice had saved her. That was the moment she'd spotted the second one. Now here she was, running through the Canadian wilderness, trying desperately to get a signal to the Griffin, all while being stalked. She wasn't sure if it was the mountainous geography or the spontaneous metaphysical event that was the cause of the signal loss, but either way, her comms weren't working. The thing must have come from the SME as well. No way they were part of the normal Canadian wildlife. Artemis stopped, bracing herself against a tree to rest, glancing towards the little trail she had dug through the snow. There was no sign of the thing, but that didn't mean much. The thing had thick white fur like a polar bear. If one wasn't moving fast or very close, Artemis didn't think she would be able to spot it. even with her better than 20/20 vision. A part of her wanted to sit down with her back against the tree to rest and cry, to try and start processing the shock and horror of seeing her two teammates killed in impossibly brutal ways. But she couldn't do that now. It was one thing her father had taught her, not to never cry, but to wait for the proper moment. He had been extremely hard on her brothers, waiting to pounce if they had shown the slightest bit of weakness. But he had always treated her differently. Sure, he put her through all the same drills and made her exercise just as long, but he never expected her to have the same stoic resolve. The few times they had really fought, her father had always made it up to her. He would come into the room after things had cooled off, kneeling down in front of her and giving that unbreakable hug of his. Then he would whisper in her ear, "I'm always going to love you, Amy, no matter what." After that, everything had been right again. But her father wasn't here now. It was just Artemis and this snow-white creature from hell. From the few good looks she had gotten, it appeared as if someone had taken gorilla and tiger DNA, blended them together, and grown them into something much bigger and more terrifying than either animal. Artemis reached up to her ear to activate her comm. "This is Artemis. Do you read, Talos?" "Come on, say something." She waited, hearing nothing but the sound of the cold wind as it whipped by, stinging her face. She reached an arm down and poked a tear in her coat. Her glove had a stain of red when she brought it back out. It was a shallow wound, not too serious. If it had been, she would already be feeling the effects, mainly dizziness and severe fatigue. She was exhausted, but it was an exhaustion she had felt many times before. "Artemis, this is Talos. Lost your signal for several minutes. What happened?" Artemis breathed a sigh of relief at the voice coming through her earpiece. Then she braced as she gave Talos the news. "Goliath and Lynx are dead." It was 5 simple words, and yet saying it out loud made her stomach lurch, as if it was her being told the news. Another gust blew past as Artemis waited for his response. "Do you copy, Talos?" "Yeah, Shit, are you hurt?" "Not seriously, but whatever got them, there's another like it, and it's hunting me." "Understood," Talos said. "The Griffin is 3 minutes out. You stay alive until then. That's an order." Artemis managed a tired smile. "You aren't my boss, but understood." She forced her way through the almost waist-deep snow, up a slope to where she would have a slightly better view of her surroundings. She had to bend over with the rifle resting on her knees as she reached the top, taking deep breaths. If it wasn't for the enhancements and miles of jogging she did every day, Artemis was sure she'd be on the ground right now, gasping for air. Getting her breath under control, Artemis straightened up and looked around, scanning for any sign of the thing that had been following. She saw nothing, but didn't sling her rifle over her shoulder, keeping it in a low, ready position instead. She would need every second to react if something came at her. It was only her second scan across the stark wilderness that her peripheral vision caught movement. Her eyes snapped to the spot, but all she saw was a few barren trees. She was about to continue on when she saw the eyes, large and black, watching her from behind the closest of trees. Fear-induced energy rushed through her system as she turned, raising her rifle. Like most versions of the weapon, her L-115A3 had a scope mounted on top, but Artemis's rifle was modified so that she could fold the scope to the side in a situation where she needed her iron sights. In the military, snipers would work with a spotter who carried a weapon for close engagements. But Artemis wasn't part of any military, and at the moment there was no one else to save her. She pointed the barrel of the rifle toward the tree, vaguely making out the shape of the monster's hunched forward body, now that she knew exactly where to look. About 30 feet away, just over 9.1 meters. After decades of doing it, her brain made the conversion effortlessly. She knew her estimate was within about a foot of being dead on. Artemis lowered her cheek and sighted down the gun. She tried to steady herself, but whether it was adrenaline, the cold, or exhaustion, she couldn't stop her hands from shaking. "Come on, get it together!" The thing shifted a foot to the right, forcing Artemis to reacquire her target. She couldn't keep the gun steady. Another memory of her father flashed through her head. He had his hand on the clay pigeon launcher, ready to send 3 of the clay discs out into the mountain hills. He had looked down at her with that stern, but not quite angry look he had when he was teaching and said, "Amy, you have the skill. You've put in the hours. I know you can do it." "I only hit 2 the last 4 times. I can't, Dad," she had said. She remembered feeling a mix of frustration at the failing and shame at having let him down. "Listen to me, Amy. You can do it. You just need to relax. Don't force it. Your body knows what to do. Just don't get in its way." She had nodded, not feeling so sure, but ready to try one last time. She raised the shotgun to her shoulder and braced her feet. "Pull!" Artemis felt the L-115 kick as the .338 Lapua Magnum round left the barrel at over 900 meters per second. She didn't even need to look to know that her shot had been dead on, right through the eye. The white monster let out a chilling sound that was something between a roar and a human scream, thrashing around and snapping one of the trees like a dry twig, throwing snow dozens of feet as it flailed massive muscled forearms. For a few terrifying seconds, Artemis thought it was going to stay up, but then its movement slowed. The monster let out one last disturbing scream, then fell face first into the snow, leaking dark blood out from its skull. Artemis lifted the action and pulled it back, dumping the casing into the snow. Despite everything else that had happened, she couldn't help but allow herself the smallest bit of pride at her shot. She had just lowered the rifle when she saw the others. 3 more of the white monsters, all hanging further back, slowly spreading out around her. Fresh adrenaline rushed through her, but Artemis could tell it wasn't having as much of an effect. She was completely drained, barely running on fumes. "If I'm fast and accurate, I might take out 2 before the 3rd gets me." She was both of those things, but that was still very optimistic. A brain shot was the only thing that might stop one of them. Artemis raised the rifle anyway. If there was one thing her dad had raised, it was a fighter, and that's how she was going to go out. "See you soon, Goliath. Lynx." She pictured them both the way they had been before the mission. Goliath was smiling through his short blonde beard, and Lynx had on his intense stare that made her think of an ancient samurai warrior. That's how she would remember them both. Artemis sighted in on the leftmost monster, aware in her peripheral vision that the others were closing the distance. They seemed to be intelligent enough to understand who she was aiming for. It was a scary thought. She let her breath out, then began to squeeze the trigger. Before she could fire, a sound caught her ear. Barely perceptible at first, but quickly growing louder. It was the familiar humming of the Griffin's 4 engines, and for Artemis, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. The monster to her left slowed and turned towards the noise, just as a barrage of 20mm rounds hit the closer one, causing it to disappear in a shower of snow and blood. The Griffin was a giant, custom-built quadcopter, part transport, part gunship. It was Talos's magnum opus. The Griffin slowed until it was hovering above her. The forward-mounted turret let out another burst of fire at the second of the 3 monsters. Artemis ignored the sudden blizzard of snow that the Griffin had kicked up and zeroed in on the last of the 3, sending off a round into the thickly furred body. It flinched but stayed on its feet. She had been right before. Nothing short of a brain shot would stop them. "Grab on," Talos's voice had said in her ear. Artemis glanced to her left and saw a thick rope hanging down and swaying from the wind of the Griffin. She collapsed the stock of her rifle and slung it over her shoulder in one quick motion, then moved for the dangling rope. She caught it and shoved one boot into the loop at the very bottom, then wrapped an arm twice around the rope before grabbing hold. "Get me out!" she shouted over the drone of the engines. The rope gave a slight jerk, then began lifting Artemis off the ground towards safety. As she spun on the end of the rope, she caught sight of the monster she had shot. the only one of the three that hadn't taken a barrage of 20mm rounds. It was rushing at her in a kind of loping gallop. Artemis lost sight of it as her spin continued. Shit! She couldn't aim her rifle while swinging by one arm. That left only her sidearm, the SIG 226 Mark 25, that was strapped to her hip. Artemis opened the holster and gripped the pistol, drawing it and aiming as she spun back towards the monster. It was closer than she expected, forcing her to lower her arm to get on target. Damn, it's fast! She began firing, struggling to stay on target, hanging onto a rope trying to hit the charging, partially camouflaged animal, all while snow was being blown in her face was one of the most difficult marksman situations Artemis had ever been in. But she was no ordinary marksman. Almost all of her shots hit near center mass. Unfortunately, her skill didn't matter. The monster didn't even seem to notice the 9mm rounds as it closed the distance. In one last powerful movement, it bent forward and leapt. Artemis's scream was lost in the roar of the engines as the beast shot up through the air, growing in size and detail. She could see the massive jaw now, with canines the size of tent stakes. Artemis emptied her last 2 rounds in its face, then swung her body to the side to avoid its swipe, feeling the claws of one of its long arms catch on her boots as it started to drop back to the ground. An impossibly heavy weight yanked her down, and Artemis gritted her teeth, dropping her P226 and holding onto the rope with every last ounce of strength she had. For one horrible moment she thought the monster's weight was going to rip her leg from her body. Then the front of her boot gave, ripping off and falling with the great white beast. The sudden weight release caused her to begin spinning wildly, and she had to keep her tight grip on the rope as she waited for her momentum to slow. Artemis felt a hand on her back and opened her eyes, looking up to see Talos's intelligent blue eyes staring back. She hadn't realized the rope had reached the griffin. Artemis took the hand he offered and let herself be pulled into the cabin. Talos hit a button on the wall, and the door began to slide close, locking with a whir of gears. Artemis swallowed, then cleared her throat. You sure you shouldn't be in the pilot seat? She glanced towards the front of the quadcopter. I built the autopilot, it's perfect, Talos replied. He suddenly frowned and knelt down in front of her. Damn, you're bleeding. We should have brought Miracle along. It looks worse than it is. I can patch myself up. You just get us back to the Institute in one piece. You sure? Talos said. He reached up to one of the overhead compartments and grabbed the first aid kit, setting it beside her. I'm fine. Talos gave her a long stare, then nodded. So, Goliath and Lynx, they're really... He stopped himself just before saying it. Dead, Artemis confirmed. She felt a tightness building in her chest. Talos reached a hand up and rubbed his eyes. I knew it could happen to one of us. I just never thought the big man would go down first. Artemis pushed herself to her feet and rested a hand on his arm. Went down fighting. Took out one of them with just his knife. Talos gave a sad smile. Couldn't imagine him going out any other way. He glanced down at the first aid kit, then back to Artemis. Yell if you need any help with that. Will do. Talos moved forward through the narrow space to the cockpit. Artemis grabbed the kit, then stepped over one of the seats, slumping into it. Another memory of her father surfaced. He was giving her a talk after she'd sprained her ankle during a hike. You stay strong now, Amy. You stay strong until this is done. When we get home where it's safe, you can cry as much as you want. Artemis clutched the med kit in her lap and leaned forward, letting the tears fall.